Every Dune fan knows what a thumper is, but what happens to them after they're used to summon a sandworm? One theory is particularly gross. In Denis Villeneuve's adaptation of Frank Herbert's sci-fi epic Dune, the desert-dwelling Fremen have learned a clever way to live in the wastelands of Arrakis, even as mile-long destructive sandworms furtively burrow around under their feet. For one, they've discovered that the sandworms are attracted to steady, regular ground beats and have altered their walking to be irregular in response.
We're about to enter worm territory. We can't walk like regular humans. If we do, we're dead.
The Fremen have also learned how to ride on the backs of the sandworms using an elaborate and dangerous lassoing method that takes years to refine. A Fremen worm rider will climb to the top of a sand dune and insert a small, forearm-length device called a thumper into the ground. A thumper, as its name implies, regularly pounds on the ground, deliberately attracting a sandworm. When a worm explodes out of the sand and charges for the thumper, the Fremen rider will leap on and attach grappling devices called maker hooks to its scales. They can then climb up onto the speeding worm and keep it above ground by holding the flaps of its scales open. The reason this works is because the worm will do anything it can to stop sand from working its way into the more sensitive tissue that lies beneath its scales. The whole thing is extremely cool, but a question arises. What happens to the thumper? Did the worm eat it? Does the Fremen rider grab it very quickly before leaping on? It seems that the Fremen, whose resources are very limited, wouldn't want to waste thumpers by leaving them behind or feeding them to their worm mounts. It likely takes a lot of time and materials to make just one thumper. The Fremen probably only have a limited supply. In a new interview, Villeneuve was grilled about the thumpers, and he had a theory as to what happens to them. It involves worm poop.
I don't believe you.
The ecology of Arrakis is bizarre, and the sandworms are a perfect example of this. The worms, as Herbert explores in several Dune sequels, feed on sand plankton and their more mature form, sand trout. It seems that sand trout insist water sources and eventually grow into the massive worms seen in the story. The sandworms essentially feed on themselves, giving birth to their own food source. Some fans assume that the spice mélange, found only on Arrakis, is actually worm poop. The spores left behind by a species that is essentially devouring itself. Keep in mind, that theory is not confirmed by any texts. As far as we know, the worms digest and leave behind scat just like any animal. This is certainly the theory posited by Villeneuve, one that he hastily invented during an interview with Gizmodo when pressed about the potentially eaten thumpers used by the Fremen. He said, "Yeah, it's a thing you ask yourself. Is there something that they can find back there out of the digestive system of the worm?" In Part 1, we're trying to avoid the sandworms as much as possible. In Part 2, you see that the Fremen embrace this beast and use them as a way of traveling in the desert. I thought it was super poetic and I absolutely loved it. But yeah, it raises a question. I'm sure the Fremen thought about that. There are no funny scenes of Fremen digging through piles of worm poop like Laura Dern in Jurassic Park, much to everyone's collective dismay. However, Villeneuve implied that's exactly what's happening when it comes to thumper retrieval. He continued theorizing, clearly not having given the latter much thought before making his movie. I'm sure that there's a way to recycle because it's a culture that is all about recycling. It's a bit like people living in space. It's an environment that's so harsh and they are very clever people. So there's a way of recycling those thumpers to find them back. We should ask a Fremen. It seems that thumper retrieval wasn't of paramount importance to Villeneuve, which makes sense. There are plenty of other more important plot points to deal with. Still, it makes us wonder. Perhaps thumpers are easily constructed, allowing the Fremen to build as many as they might need. Or perhaps they have regular access to an abandoned Atreides storehouse containing millions of thumpers and they're not yet concerned about running out. It's hard to say. As for worm poop, Villeneuve doesn't depict any on screen. Some Dune fans have posited that the worms don't digest nutrients or grow like ordinary animals because they aren't wholly organic. Some wilder theories have said that the sandworms are ancient stone-based machines that contain internal furnaces. In Herbert's Children of Dune, Paul's son Leto II says the worms came from another planet and ruined Arrakis. The passage reads, "The sand trout was introduced here from some other place. This was a wet planet then. They proliferated beyond the capability of existing ecosystems to deal with them. Sand trout insisted the available free water, made this a desert planet, and they did it to survive. In a planet sufficiently dry, they could move to their sandworm phase." Whatever the truth may be, it's still buried out there in the vast expanse of Arrakis.